Number 10. Ghost of the Dead. This worker said, "We had a younger man a few weeks ago who passed suddenly. One night after closing up and hitting the lights, we walked towards the back hallway. As I looked down the hall before heading out the door, I saw a man with dark hair and a dark suit at the end, just standing there. I thought it was a director, and when I blinked, he was gone. The director with me that day was in a light gray suit and had blonde hair. The next day, I went to close the casket in the chapel. Lo and behold, it was the same gentleman that was in the hallway the day before. Two of my coworkers said they experienced similar events, such as when walking past his casket, they felt they bumped into someone, but no one was there." That is creepy, I'm telling you. Ugh. Number 9. Stolen body. Julie Mott, who lost her life battling against cystic fibrosis, left behind a mysterious case post her death. While the funeral should have been a part of the grieving process for her friends and family, the funeral was the start of a new nightmare. Sometime after the visitation and just before closing of the funeral home, someone took Julie's body. Yeah, they just left with it. The police and family were stunned to hear this, for no one knows who actually stole the body. Theories of an obsessive unidentified boyfriend, involvement of the funeral home itself have been formed, but it is still unknown as how and where did Julie's body disappear. Now this is scary and just sad. How can someone disappear with a dead body and no one noticed? Number 8. Ghost lady. This worker said, "Most nights as we were returning to quarters from a run, my partner and I would scope the parking lot for vagrants or people who shouldn't be there before we opened the bay doors. While looking on more than one occasion, we would see a light on in the adjacent building on the top floor, and there should have been no lights on. Figuring someone had gotten inside, we would watch the building for more lights. No other lights ever came on, but on every occasion, a young woman in a dress would come to the window and stare at us. One night after seeing the figure, we got brave and called some law enforcement friends from the area to help us search the building. We went to the room that had the light on expecting to find a vagrant camped out there, but the only thing we found was a room that had untouched dust on the floor and no light bulbs in the sockets. We got the willies and split, and we never went back to that building at night." Yeah, I would never go back to that building. Ever. Like, that sounds terrifying. Number 7. Missing head. In July 1986, Anthony Parisi passed away at the age of 83. Anthony, a co-founder of a grocery store in Mount Vernon, New York, died of natural causes. He was sent to a funeral home, and on July 26, the employees of the funeral home went to prepare him for his burial, but when they looked into his casket, they discovered that his head was missing. Yeah, just his whole head, just poof. Gone. The police were called, and they speculated that someone broke into the funeral home during midnight and used a razor or scalpel to remove the head. Once the head was cut off, the intruder took it with them. Nothing else in the funeral home was stolen or perturbed. There weren't even signs of break-in. The police were baffled by the case, and they have no idea who stole the head, why it was stolen, and they don't know what happened to it because it was never found. Number 6. Spirits of the dead. This online user said, "My grandpa was a mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. One day, her boyfriend Tom came over to the house and no one was home. They'd been dating for a while and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and windows into the morgue were open, so he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything, and went into the house. A few minutes later, he heard a loud slamming noise come from the morgue, so he ran to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open again. He got out of there real quick, and when he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up a deceased woman that morning and the spirits were welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time, Tom should just leave the doors and windows open." Number 5. Doppelganger. This worker says, "I was once working at a mortuary and had to pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get the receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double checked the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos and similar similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey, how's it going? Ah, holy that guy looks like you." It's the only case I've had nightmares about that I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening it up. Now that sounds absolutely horrifying, and I can't imagine that happening. Number 4. New home. A family bought a funeral home and turned it into a house, which, why? But this is what the father said of the experience. "Many people that have worked here or rented have told me about hearing sounds and seeing black shadows during all hours. One of the things that turned me to wonder about all of this even more is the children saying things about a black fog in different rooms during the night. It's apparent that something is causing all of this, whispers in the hallway, lights going out and coming back on, leaving rooms with lights on and seeing them turn off, even water turning on and off. Finally, when people remodeling came to me and said something about a high-pitched drilling noise from the basement one afternoon, I told myself and my wife I'd humor everyone and speak with a local psychic. I did so the same afternoon of the drilling, and the psychic was a nice lady, but I was frustrated that all she kept saying and insisting to me was that I shouldn't remodel and stir up the spirits in the building, and I am causing nothing but problems some people in the community would choose to forget. Before the phone call ended, I remember very well the last thing she said: "You, sir, are playing with fire." So after a few days, I called a local Christian preacher who prayed for me and claimed I was involved in a demonic process and should come to church Sunday morning before it's too late. He did finally come over to the building and did some water sprinkles of whatever it is called around the place, but when he left, everything started freaking out. Lights would turn off and on, and we would start getting lightheaded sometimes when we walked through areas of the building. So now, ever since that day, my wife won't stay in a room alone when we are here. We still don't really have any clear answers on the building, the items inside, or its terrible history, but after we finish remodeling, we hopefully clean and rid ourselves of the spirits of Jacob's funeral home. Now, this is literally the beginning of a horror movie, and they should move out. Right now. Number 3. Peeking from the hallway. This is a story about someone's childhood experience. They said, "There aren't many options in my town for funeral homes, so almost everyone in town has been to all of them at some point in their lives for service. I remember as a child sitting on a chair in the lobby of one of the more prominent funeral homes, bored out of my mind during a visitation for a distant relative. A kid I knew from school walks up and says hi, and we start to chat when something catches my eye. Far down the hallway, going into a closed off area of the funeral home, I see the hands of an old man come around the corner and grasp onto the wall. Slowly, the old man peeks his head around the corner and just stares blankly down the hallway into the visitation room. I'm thoroughly weirded out, and I look over at my friend who is staring down the hall. He turns to me and says, "What is he doing?" When we look back, the man is gone. I'm sorry, but the image of that is absolutely terrifying. I hate it. I have goosebumps. No. He continued on by saying, "We didn't ever really talk about it again until 20 years later when I got a call from my old friend out of the blue. He says this is going to sound crazy, but do you remember the old man at the funeral home? It was a little hazy on it, but I did remember." He continues to say, "Well, I was just there and my daughter saw him. During the viewing for my Uncle Bill, she came over and asked my wife why the creepy man down the hallway was staring around the corner at Uncle Bill, and there wasn't anyone there, man. I could hear the fear in his voice and I instantly got chills. I have been back to that funeral home many times now and I've not seen anything else, but I still get uneasy anytime I walk past that hallway." And yeah, that makes sense. Number 2. Body moved by itself. This online user said my neighbor a while back before I moved in was a mortician. One night he had a body he was preparing for a very early morning wake or service. Whatever was going on, it was unusual and it required him to work in the wee hours in the morning on this particular corpse. So as he's working on it, he turned his back to grab some tools or supplies, and the angle he was standing at with regard to the corpse left the body visible just out of the the corner of his eye. As he was looking down at whatever tools he was getting, in the corner of his eye he saw the body slowly start to sit up. His fight or flight instinct immediately kicked in and he ran to the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but he was so clumsy trying to get up the stairs he tripped and was pretty much crawling and clawing his way to the top. He was just near the top before his senses finally came back and he knew it was rigor mortis. He collected himself and started to laugh at how absurd it was. He'd been doing this for 15 to 20 years at that point and he had never had a freakout like that before where instinct took over knowledge and experience. He actually sheepishly admitted he had to go clean himself because he had soiled his pants in a panic. Dead bodies do weird things, I'm telling you. But I would probably have to change my pants too if that happened to me. And coming in at number 1 is waking up. This is a story a user posted online saying, when my cousin was 18, he was in a bad wreck and he, his girlfriend, and his sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" Yep. He wasn't actually dead. The funeral director said it was the first time he had ever had to go home and change his pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital, and the same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead, but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state. But a few weeks later, he walked out of the hospital. He has horrible headaches on occasion, but he's led a successful life and he's a great guy. I mean, what a positive turn of events, but that would be so shocking. It's one thing for the body to move on its own, but speak, that's on a whole new level.
Number 10, moaning dead people. You're working at a funeral home. Late at night, you start hearing moaning. And not fun moaning. Well, you won't want to hear that in a funeral home either. I guess my point is, if you're in a house full of dead people, you don't want to hear any sort of moaning, okay? Pleasurable or otherwise. Well, if you work at a funeral home, this is actually pretty common. When people die, our bodies start to fill with gases. And when those gases escape, the body can make moaning sounds. The technical term for this is spooky toots. The freaky thing about this is this usually happens when you're moving the body. You're already doing a creepy job of moving bodies in a funeral home, and then you have this thing sighing at you. No thank you. I think I'm going to keep making YouTube videos and living in a basement apartment. Number 9, ghosts. Now you build a place where you can store dead bodies. Chances are you're going to get a ghost or two. It could just be staying in a funeral home late at night, could have the overnight security guard feeling a little jumpy. Or maybe the ghosts of dead people follow their bodies to the funeral home, meet a bunch of other dead ghosts, and it's a pretty chill hang. Then they decide to stay. All speculations aside, there's been numerous reports of people in funeral homes feeling cold spots, seeing ghostly figures that resemble their loved ones, or even seeing ghosts sitting in the service during funerals. Imagine having to watch your own funeral, seeing everyone who bails. Like, I can't believe Mark isn't here. I helped him move 3 times. There's even this story from a mortician who is doing his mortician thing, getting bodies ready, looking good for their big day. He goes to take a leak, and there's a guy in the bathroom in a blue suit. The man walks past him, he doesn't really get a good look at him, then he goes back to work, and he realized it was the same guy he was working on. 8. A resurrection. Usually if someone dies, they stay dead. I mean, that's a pretty hard and fast rule, no exceptions. Except for like Jesus, and apparently the baby of Swapna Michaelis Revenus. The baby was born July 1st, 2017. She was premature and very underweight. Not a hot start for this little one. The couple and their baby were transferred to another hospital, and sadly the baby passed away. The doctors told Swapna and Michaela that she was too weak, so the parents were crushed. They left to a funeral home to set up arrangements for their daughter. But while they were inside the funeral home, the baby began to move. She pulled a full Jesus 3 days faster. The parents were elated to have their baby back, but they were also furious that the doctor told them that their baby was dead. So they stormed the hospital, and police had to stop them from killing the doctor. Number 7, an extra body. If you work in a funeral home, you must come up with pretty great ideas of how to ditch a body. I mean, I'm not saying I would do it, but say stuff 2 bodies in one casket during a closed casket funeral so nobody knows the body's in there and you dispose of it without anyone noticing. Well, that's exactly what Mark Villela did. He got in a fight with his girlfriend and then stabbed her to death in her sleep. And then he got a big old light bulb over his head. He was like, hey, I have to work a closed casket funeral tomorrow. So he brought his dead girlfriend to the funeral home, stuffed her in a casket with an 89-year-old woman. Everyone sat there and mourned 2 people unknowingly, and Mark thought he was the cleverest guy in town. But when Mark's girlfriend never showed up for work, people got suspicious and started looking for her. Not long after that, he was arrested, and the CCTV footage showed him in the funeral home with her body, stuffing it into the case, and he didn't even run to Mexico. You always run to Mexico. Number 6, a wink. I don't know if you've ever been to a funeral or if you've ever seen them reenacted on TV or in movies, but a very common theme is that the deceased person's eyes are always closed, because there's nothing quite as unsettling as having a dead person staring at you. Well, in one special case, an elderly woman was very proud of her glass eye. I think some old people just get really bored. So she put in her will that she wanted her glass eye to be on display when she passed. And she didn't mean on display like in a nice little box next to her casket. She wanted it in her head, one eye open, so everyone could see her winking. Now, her family and loved ones knew that this was supposed to happen, but the funeral director's assistant didn't. So when she opened the casket, she got a face full of dead old lady winking at you. In the funeral business, they call that a winky pinkaboo. Number 5, a clown. What happens to a clown after they die? Do they go to the great big top in the sky? Or do they get shot of a cannon straight into hell? It probably depends on how many kids they made cry. But what I can tell you is I never want to go to a clown funeral. Clowns are creepy enough as it is without the risk of one of them crawling back to life from the underworld. However, if you work at a funeral home, you don't really get to choose which funerals you go to, and apparently on this day, you didn't get to choose what you wore either. During this clown's funeral, everyone working the funeral had to be dressed up as clowns. Also, it shouldn't be surprised that many of the people who came to the funeral were also dressed up as clowns, and they painted a single tear on their face in makeup. Baggy clothes, a love for rhyming, single tears painted on their faces. I didn't know thugs and clowns had so much in common. Number 4, a missing body. This one isn't so much what was found, but what wasn't. Back in 2015, a young woman by the name of Julie Mott sadly passed away. Her family went to the funeral home to make necessary arrangements. The next morning, when one of the funeral directors went to go check on the body, it was gone. Now, my first response would be looting because the zombie apocalypse has started. But this funeral director was a little more grounded. The funeral director contacted the family, who then contacted the police. The police launched an investigation. Now, there wasn't much to go on except for one really creepy dude. Apparently, there had been someone who attended Julie's funeral, and even though he wasn't close family, he was the last person to leave. He also had been texting Julie constantly in the days leading up to her death. The police couldn't link the disappearance of Julie's body to the creepy fellow, and her body was never found. Number 2, a moving corpse. This one was written by Redditor the_8_Henry. He wrote about a story that his neighbor told him who works as a mortician. One day, the guy was doing his body prepping thing late at night. He had to wake early the next morning. He turned his back to grab some tools, and in the corner of his eye, he saw the body starting to sit up straight. Insane core strength. Well, of course that's the most terrifying thing that can happen to you, so the guy ran right out of the room. He had sprinted halfway up the stairs before he was like, oh yeah, I've been doing this for 20 years. That's just rigor mortis. I think if that happened to me, I would just quit my mortician job and take those skills and become a hairstylist.
Starting us off with number 10 are the pains of divorce. So back in 1999, Mark Vallejo was a funeral director and he worked at the home with his wife of 2 years, Exley. One night he found a letter in his home that she had written for her lover. They started talking things over and things got a bit heated. Exley called her sister and told her that they were having an argument, but her sister thought nothing of it as it was quite a regular occurrence. The next day, Exley never called her sister back and she never showed up for work either, and on top of that, Mark didn't call in and ask if she was there as he usually did. At least stay consistent, Mark. 3 days later, with no sign of Exley, her sister called the police and Mark admitted that they had had a fight but that she just left him. But that didn't really add up because she wouldn't leave her son behind and her car was still very much in their driveway. Did she leave you on foot, Mark? I mean, probably could be, but the police didn't buy it and investigated further. They found out that the day they spoke to Mark, he'd also hosted a closed casket funeral for an elderly woman named Marjorie. Police theorized that maybe Mark put Exley's body in with Marjorie's and buried them both. They were about to exhume the casket when Mark finally admitted to stabbing Exley in her sleep. He didn't want to lose custody of their child or go through an expensive abusive divorce, so he just killed her, which is clearly the next obvious step. Coming in at number 9 is Julie Mott. Maybe some of you will actually know this case since it's quite recent. In 2015, San Antonio, Texas, Julie Mott lost her battle with cystic fibrosis. After her visitation, the home closed for the day, but before they did, somehow someone managed to take Julie's body out of her casket and out of the home. Police initially suspected her ex-boyfriend, who was apparently obsessive and also the last person seen leaving the chapel. But that came up short. Cadaver dogs searched his house, his car, his everything, and found nothing. The second theory was that perhaps someone who objected to cremation took the body. But if that was true, they could have just taken any body in the home, why Julie's in specific? Third theory was that the home lost her body or had it prematurely cremated. The owner of the home, Robert Dick Tips, yup, that is his real name, denied this and said he was the one who helped organize searches for her body in the first few weeks after the disappearance, and even offered a 20 grand reward for information. Fair enough, Dick, I'll give you that. Either way, her body was never found till this day, nor did they find out who could have taken it. It still blows my mind how someone did this in broad daylight. How do you escape with a body in broad daylight? At number 8, we have the sobbing. Now this one comes from user SpiceMaster242, who works as an embalmer. During her first shift, she went to the bathroom in the back of the funeral home, and when she came out, she heard a faint sobbing sound as well as feet shuffling on the floor. She knew it was definitely feet because the floor was made of this gravelly material, so it made a specific sound if you walked on it. She followed the sound to a room where they stored embalmed bodies ready for delivery to their individual funeral homes. She thought maybe a family member may have snuck in and was crying, but there was no living person there. The only body in there was a young girl who had shot herself in the side of the head. She still never found out where the sobbing was coming from, but the user did have a semi-heart attack, so there's that. Filling our number 7 slot is the trash man. Now Bobby Wilkes was a 51-year-old funeral director living in Tennessee. His go-to thing was telling families not to watch the lowering of the casket because it would be too emotionally taxing, which is fair, I mean, he could be right. In October 1988, Bobby was giving another family the same talk, so they didn't end up watching the casket lowering, but they were looking at Wilkes. They saw him throw potted flowers into the grave, and he didn't even put a lid on the vault. The lid which cost the family an extra $375. They went to the police straight away and had Wilkes arrested. Once this hit the news, it was like a domino effect. Complaint after complaint was being filed against him from previous families. They wanted their loved ones' bodies exhumed to check the real damage he had done. Now at least 10 of the coffins were stuffed to the brim with garbage, and I'm talking bags of hair, bottles, dirty diapers, even dog food. 2 coffins weren't even buried straight, they were buried on their side, and one literally had an arm sticking out of the coffin. But at least they got caskets, one man didn't even get that. He pleaded guilty to 48 different charges and was sentenced to nearly 29 years in prison. Now at number 6 is Death's Grip. This one's from user Kittens, which is just very fitting for someone working in a funeral home. The user used to work in tissue recovery for organ donors, and that includes having to shave the person's arms and legs. One day they were working on a person who had died very recently, so the body was fresh. They held his arm up so they could shave it, and his fingers slowly but surely started curling around the user's hand. Having done this many times, the user knew it was just rigor mortis kicking in, but they were still exceptionally creeped out. I love how they were just freaked out. I would have already by then. What if they just didn't let me go? And also, is it like a baby's grip? They may be small, but when they hold your finger, they really hold it, you know? So is it the same thing? Start of life mimics end of life? Coming in at number 5 is the private goodbye. Now this person used to work at a funeral home during their teen years because apparently working as a waitress or in retail was too mainstream for them. One day after an open casket viewing, a man came in saying he wanted to say goodbye to the deceased privately. And that was a pretty common occurrence, so the user thought nothing of it. They led him to the viewing room and let him be. A few minutes later, the staff heard this loud popping sound and then footsteps of someone running and then a door slam. They ran into the viewing room thinking maybe the guy took off with the body, but it was still there when they got there. But that wasn't the issue. The weird thing was the face just looked strange. The mouth was hanging open weirdly and the skin just didn't seem set like it did before. They realized the dude punched the corpse and then took off. Settle your grudges before you die, people, otherwise someone's gonna punch you in the face. At number 4 is the underwear. So back in 1998 in Kentucky, reports circulated of a break-in at a funeral home, which is just weird because I feel like if you're gonna break in anywhere, make it a bank, not a funeral home. But anyway, the staff looked around for any missing items, but nothing seemed amiss until they looked inside the casket of 9-year-old Brittany Ray Bradley. She died after a fierce 2-year battle with a rare type of cancer, and the home had hosted a visitation for her earlier that day. The thing that went missing was her underwear. When the family was informed, they immediately accused her 31-year-old cousin Mark Calebs of the theft, which is so weird. If they didn't even hesitate to accuse him, he must have been doing something messed up with her or to her before she died, or he must have just been a weirdo in general. Like, something was definitely up for them to accuse him that bloody quickly, let's face it. The police checked the camper where he lived, and lo and behold, the underwear was there. There was no sign of evidence of sexual abuse to the body, but Mark was charged regardless. And finally, at number 1 are the Pestanikas, and I'm glad I left this one till the end because boy is it a good one. And by good, I mean messed up, so here we go. In 1982, a 90-year-old retired man named Joseph Cly had black lungs, so he went to the hospital. While he was there, he made his own funeral arrangements with Helen and Walter Pestanikas. After staying at the hospital for a good month, he decided to go live with Helen and Walter instead of his stepson, which was already, I feel like, the first red flag in the story, but let's continue. The couple themselves were in their 60s, and they set up Joseph in a converted patio area. 2.5 years later, he was found dead there, but authorities noted the place he was staying at was unfit for human habitation. There was no insulation, no fridge, no sink, and human waste was everywhere. The medical examiner ruled that Joseph had suffered from severe dehydration and starved to death since he hadn't eaten for days before his death. The body was returned to the couple since he paid them for a funeral. He also didn't really have many relatives left, and the ones he did have couldn't afford a funeral for him. So back to Walter and Helen he went. In less than a week after his death, police went back to his room to investigate more, but found that the couple had gotten it cleaned and painted and put a walker in there that wasn't there before. The couple was arrested for holding Joseph captive and starving him to death and then stealing his money. Helen had access to his bank account, and what used to be 35 grand was now only $55. Where did the money go? It's not like Joseph was using it in his tiny room. The couple claimed the autopsy was botched and he died of natural causes. So his body was exhumed, and the medical examiner knew automatically that something was wrong. They were stitching on his stomach area, and his stomach and other organs had been replaced with ones from someone who had eaten before dying. No one knows where these organs came from and where Joseph's went, but the couple were charged with 3rd-degree murder.
Coming at number 10, we have a dead man's handshake. I don't think I could work at a morgue because I would never be able to shake the idea that at any moment one of these bodies could come back to life and try and take me to the underworld, or I would be working at the morgue that would be the location where the zombie outbreak starts. Well, my fears would almost come true if I was Reddit user PM me kittens please. They used to work at a morgue and they had the lovely job of tissue recovery. It was their job to shave the bodies before someone would come in and start taking pieces off of this person's dead body. And I mean, that's a very noble job because it's absolutely terrifying, but you're helping save people. Well, one time PM me kittens please was shaving a body, and when they picked up the person's arm by the hand, the deceased person's fingers curled around their hand. I would have let out such a high-pitched scream that every glass cup for a 3-mile radius would have exploded. Apparently, this is somewhat common, but I still don't think I would be looking out for it. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Next on the list, we have trying to be pretty. Reddit user Medic Genius worked in a morgue and they had seen a ton of crazy things. Something I didn't know, but I'm glad they do, is that they will check your body after you die to find out more about your death. I thought they only do this if there was a murder involved, but I guess they do it just for the research. Well, after a 60-year-old woman came in after a serious car crash, they found something very interesting when they did an x-ray on her head. She had a tube of lipstick lodged in her brain. The only logical answer for this is that she was speeding down the street trying to get somewhere. Based on the force of the crash, it's estimated that she was driving at around 75 kilometers an hour. Well, she must have been in a huge rush and throwing on lipstick while she was driving because she wasn't paying attention to the road, and then she drove into a tree and the lipstick ended up in her skull. I know sometimes it can seem like everything is on the line when we're running late for something, but it's much safer to show up late and then deal with whatever is on the other side rather than putting your life at risk and trying to make it somewhere on time. Coming in at number 8, we have Not Quite Dead. You would think that with all the technology we have now, we would be able to tell if a person is in fact dead. Well, it turns out that we can still make that mistake. Carlos Camelo Mayo was in a car accident that should have left him in a box, and everyone at the scene thought that he was indeed dead. He was declared dead at the scene of the accident and then taken to the morgue. His wife was called and came in to ID the body, but to her surprise she was greeted by her husband standing there very much alive. So what happened? Well, he was knocked out cold, and the people at the morgue didn't notice he was actually alive until he screamed out in pain when he woke up to doctors cutting into his skin for the autopsy. That would be like a horror movie. You would be terrified, but after you figured out what happened, you probably would just be happy to be alive. Coming in at number 7, we have It's Still Breathing. Reddit user Darker Than My Soul had an encounter with a corpse at a morgue that sounds like it was pulled right out of an Eli Roth movie. Apparently you can have something happen when fresh bodies are brought into the morgue that makes it seem like they're still breathing. The gas in the person's body is escaping. Our Reddit user thought that the other people in the morgue were messing with him because he was on the night shift, and all night he could hear what sounded like breathing coming from a couple of the dead bodies. Our Reddit user had been taught that off-gassing was something that could happen, but it was his first time encountering it in person, and the shock of having it happen in person made him think that any moment these bodies could pop up and chase him down the hallway. Coming in number 6, we have Sit Straight Up. The human body is one powerful machine, and it would seem that death isn't even strong enough to stop it from moving. This story went viral a few years ago about an American mortician who had been working in the industry for upwards of 15 years. One day he had a body delivered that needed to be all prepped and ready for its own funeral. Well, he had the body on the table beside him, and something very strange happened. He saw the body start to sit up straight, and before any of you get the bright idea that this was one of his colleagues that was picking up the body to freak him out, no, I will tell you that there was no one else in the room. Well, just like any of us, he ran straight out of the room. He was sprinting so fast and in such a panic that he tripped going up the stairs and started crawling to get to the top of the stairs because he was in hysterics. It wasn't until he reached the top that his senses finally came back to him, and he realized that the body was sitting up because of rigor mortis. He had seen this hundreds of times before, and this was just another day on the job. But sometimes when you have been doing this for so long, you forget how creepy your job actually is. Coming in at number 5, we have The Old Switcheroo. Now here's a good reason why I should never be in the funeral industry. You really can make no mistakes, and I'm more of a fall and get back up kind of guy. Learn from your mistakes and come back better and stronger. Well, if you work in a morgue, people aren't going to be as forgiving when you make a mistake with a dead body. Back in 2017, there was a big mistake made with Sandra Bennett's body. Her family was all set up for her funeral, and when they got the casket with the body inside, they realized that it wasn't Sandra. Now obviously everyone was freaking out because where on earth was Sandra? Well, it turns out that she was at another funeral, but not in the state that her family wanted. Because this funeral home mixed up the bodies, they accidentally cremated Sandra for another funeral because they thought she was someone else. The whole mix-up was terrible now for the other family when they found out the remains of the person they had at their funeral wasn't even their family member. Coming in at number 4, we have today's special. Reddit user Mr. Sloozy13 wrote about some wild stories that his father told him. His dad was a lifelong worker at a funeral home. There was one story that really stuck out to me because it's probably going to be etched in my head for the rest of my life. One time his dad had to go retrieve a body and take it back to the morgue. Well, this person in question who had passed away was an old man who was running himself a bath. Unfortunately, he passed away while in the bath. From the perspective of the old man, not a bad way to go. We all have to go eventually, and a nice warm bath would be kinda comfy. But for our Reddit user's dad, well, he had to go pick up a body that had been sitting in a tub of water for who knows how long, and now the body was somewhat of a human soup. I really respect the people that have the stomach to deal with that kind of stuff because someone has to do it, and I really don't want it to be me. Coming in at number 3, we have Tender. We are going from one story of a body left in a bad situation for too long to the next. Reddit user Kuda Ravage worked in a funeral home, and one day they got a call to pick up an older woman whose body had been laying unchecked for months. As you can imagine, it wasn't the best scene to walk in on. What made this situation even worse was that she was left in an attic that was kept very warm. For months, this woman's body had been baking in this attic. Kuda Ravage described picking up the pieces of this woman's body as pulling off tender pieces of turkey. So that's some nice imagery for you guys. I wonder if that thought will float back into your head next time time you sit down for Christmas dinner. Coming in at number 2, we have Not Actually Dead. Now I think this has to be one of the things that I am most afraid of. There are old stories of people being buried with a string that goes from their coffin up to the surface and it's attached to a bell. This way, if the person isn't actually dead, they could ring the bell, and if someone is around, they could quickly dig them up. Now these are old stories, so you would think that nothing like this could ever happen in this day and age. Well, you would be wrong, and it sounds like one of the most terrifying things imaginable. Back in 2014, a woman named Maria de Jesus would be pronounced dead and taken to the morgue. Much later, her family would be setting up for her funeral, but the funeral workers had some bad news. Maria's body had been disfigured a little bit. It seems that someone had dropped her on her face because she had a broken nose and cuts on her cheeks. Well, this obviously infuriated the family, and they called for an investigation so they could find out what the people at the morgue were doing to the bodies. Well, it turns out the injuries to Maria's face came from when she was alive. The people who pronounced her dead were wrong, and then Maria was taken to a morgue and thrown into a freezer. In the freezer, she woke up and struggled to get out. In the struggle, she injured her face and then passed away for real in the cold. And coming at the number 1 spot, we have The Lord of the Flies. This story was thrown on Reddit by Mr. Gogo Mofo. They were in medical school to work with the county medical examiner's office, and for some of your training you actually have to go on site to pick up bodies. Well, it seems that the policy at this office is to jump right into the deep end, because the first time a Reddit user would go on site to see a body, it would be at the house of a hoarder. There were reports of a terrible smell coming from the house, and when he walked inside, he wrote that it smelled horrendous. There were piles of food, cans, old tapes, and just garbage all over the place. And when he finally got to the body, the thing was completely infested with insects. They were flying all over the place and literally pouring out of the body. Now it was his job to get the thing in a bag and take it back to the office for examination. I hope you don't have a fear of bugs, because that would probably push you to your limit.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Gilberto Arroyo. This Brazilian man was pronounced dead back in 2012 after his body had been identified at the morgue by his brother. A terribly tragic story. Gilberto worked at a car wash in the town he lived in, and one day while at work there was a killing that took place. When the body arrived at the morgue, they had family of the staff come to try and identify who exactly had been killed, and unfortunately Gilberto's brother had the awful task of doing so. Flash forward to the day of the funeral, and the family members are standing alongside the coffin, mourning his death and lamenting how people could be so cruel. So imagine their surprise when Gilberto turns up at the door. Yeah, turns out that this was just a case of mistaken identity, and this killer had taken another employee's life, and the brother misidentified his own sibling as the victim. I'm not gonna lie, there would probably be a lot of confusing emotions in that moment. Gilberto himself was probably really glad to be alive and see how his family loved him, but he might want to keep an eye on his brother, who apparently has no idea what he looks like. In our number 9 spot today, we have Noella Rakundo. Back in 2016, this story made headlines as a resident of Australia returned home to attend the funeral of her stepmother. This is obviously very sad, but not abnormal, but the story quickly gets out of hand as, unbeknownst to her, her husband had some sinister plans. He arranged a hit on his own wife. His plan was meant to take place while she was traveling for the funeral, and those who were hired to carry out the plan even did grab her. However, these turned out to be very empathetic hitmen for their line of work, because they realized what the situation was and that the hit was ordered by her own husband, so they felt a little bad and let her go. She returned home with a plan. At her own funeral, she planned to confront him and reveal his terrible plans and how they had failed. In the end, he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, which likely would have been a lot more should those men have not let the woman go. In our number 8 spot today, we have Walter Williams. Walter was 78 years old and living in Mississippi when, on February 26, 2014, he was pronounced dead. There of course is a system with these things, and Walter began going through these steps. There's paperwork completed, he was placed in a body bag, and he was taken to the funeral home to be prepared for his funeral. William, however, only made it as far as the embalming room when those with him got quite a fright. His legs started to move. The coroner then looked closer and saw that he was even breathing, just slightly. Walter was in fact alive. In a turn of events though, this new lease on life turned out to be short-lived, as just a little over 2 weeks later, he passed away, for real this time. His family even double-checked. just to be sure. In our number 7 spot today, we have Nicephorus Glycus. This is a man who was working as a bishop in Lesbos, Greece, when he was pronounced dead on March 3rd, 1896. Based on the traditions at the time, his body was then placed on display at the Methmony Church. This might seem like a strange practice, but in this particular story, it truly worked out for the best. On the second night of what is known as the exposition of the corpse, things drastically changed. It was on that night that the bishop just sat up. Apparently he even demanded to know what all the fuss was about. He was totally confused. Turns out he was asleep or something? I'm not entirely sure how no one knew he was in fact alive in this scenario, but in the end everything was fine and he continued on with his bishop duties until his true death date came. In our number 6 spot today we have Edison Vicuna. This man from Ecuador has a story that starts when he went missing for 3 days and his family began to assume the worst. After these 3 days there was a body of a man found who had been in a terrible car accident that left his face unable to be identified through those means. The man was taken by the authorities and a post-mortem examination was conducted, and this is when the body was confirmed to be that of Edison's. The family was of course distraught and began mourning their loss immediately, which included planning a funeral. As the day of the funeral came, the family members and loved ones were terribly sad and going through the motions before everyone began screaming in horror as Edison himself, very much alive, turned up to the funeral pretty drunk too. The funeral was stopped and the body was returned to the morgue. As it turns out, Edison was in fact alive and the body was later properly identified and it belonged to someone completely different. In our number 5 spot today we have the couple Telepathy. There was an elderly couple who had been married for over 50 years and they were so close they joked about being able to hear each other's thoughts. I feel like Taylor can hear my thoughts already. I don't know, man. It's only been like a year and a half, but that man? He's a mind reader. Unfortunately, in this scenario, the woman fell ill and after a couple days of being in a coma, she passed. Her husband was of course terribly upset over the loss of his life partner and had to be pried away from her. He became very distraught and began insisting that his wife was still alive. Even after she had been buried, he begged for her body to be exhumed, saying he had visions and dreams of her trying to get out of her coffin. After this went on for a while, they finally agreed to dig up the coffin in order to give the man some peace of mind, but when they opened the coffin, to everyone except for the man's surprise, they saw bloody scratch marks all over the inside of the coffin, and the woman's fingernails were bent backwards. Maybe they really could hear each other's thoughts. Either way, they definitely should have listened to him sooner. In our number 4 spot today we have Figaliu Mkametsvdov. This Russian woman suddenly collapsed back in 2011 at her home following a heart attack. She was quickly rushed to the hospital, but soon after arriving, she was pronounced dead. A few days later, her body lay in a coffin at a funeral home as her loved ones gathered to pay their respects and say their final goodbyes. While everyone, including her, was really surprised when she woke up at her own funeral. As she lay in the coffin, she woke up, saw mourners around her crying, people praying for her, and she abruptly realized what was going on and she began screaming. She was quickly rushed back to the hospital where she only lived for an additional 12 minutes in intensive care before she passed again, this time permanently. It is clear that this entire ordeal took quite a toll because in the end, heart failure was listed as her official cause of death. In our number 3 spot today we have Mohammed Rayan. After a government airstrike took the lives of over 100 people in Syria, Mohammed was identified as one of the casualties of the incident. He was inside of a local shop when the strike occurred and he was pronounced dead, although buried under the rubble of the blast. Hearing this tragic news, his friends and family began to plan his funeral and even went ahead with it without his body, because at that point it was unclear if it would ever be returned to them based on the size of this mass casualty. Well, those that loved him were in for quite a shock when Muhammad himself turned up to his own funeral. Turns out that Muhammad was in fact buried under the rubble, but he was alive. He was trapped for 36 hours before finding a way to free himself, and when he turned up at the funeral, he even still had debris on him. I can't even imagine what everyone there was feeling. The funeral undoubtedly turned into a major party. In our number 2 spot today we have Hamdi Hafez Al-Nubi. Hamdi was working as a waiter in Egypt back in 2012, but one day at work he suffered a heart attack that ended up claiming his life. He was declared dead and his family took his body back home and washed it, which was a part of their traditions in order to prepare the body for burial at the end of the week. Later, when the doctor was called in order to officially sign the final death certificate, he noticed something strange. He began to examine Hamdi's body further, and this is when he noticed that not only was it still warm,
but that he was still breathing. The doctor alerted Hamdi's mother, who was absolutely elated to find out this news. As far as I could find, it appears as though once recovered, Hamdi was totally fine, albeit probably a little shaken up after what he had just endured. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Countess Emma. This story starts off in 1761 when Countess Emma married the very wealthy Earl of Mount Edgecombe. Flash forward to a time when Emma met quite an untimely fate and she was pronounced dead. She ended up being buried, and her burial included her being laid to rest with a valuable ring. There was a church steward who had been spying on the family as this burial was taking place, and this little spy noticed this valuable ring and devised a plan to steal it. He returned under the cover of darkness, but when he went to snatch the ring, Emma is said to have awoken, cold, confused, and dressed in her burial shroud. The thief was fairly terrified and probably thought he was seeing a zombie, so he quickly fled the scene, never to be heard from again. Emma, however, made the half-mile journey back to her home, where everyone was absolutely shocked to see her alive. To commemorate this absolutely bonkers story, the estate where she once lived now has the Countess Path, which is a walkway dedicated to the journey that Emma took from the grave back home. In the end, Emma met her actual death in 1807.